All this morning. Thanks for being here for another adult formation. And this week we're continuing to hear stories about the story of us. And today's session we'll be focusing really on how Epiphany has got ready over the years, how Epiphany has heard God's calling throughout the decades. And we have with us several panelists who will be talking to us about some of that history, sharing some of Epiphany's history, and the panel will be moderated by our own Lisa Daly, who has for a very long time been a member of the outreach committee and who is one of the movers and shakers in our church. So I'm so excited to have her with us this morning, and I'm so glad to see all of you. And with that, Lisa, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Nicole, for your kind introduction. And I just wanted to preface before we get started to set the context. And if you've been to Zoom Church and heard Amy's sermon and heard the gospel reading, we heard a little bit about how God calls us to step into the light. He called the Israelites, and doing that by stories about a snake that you'll hear about if you haven't already, a kind of an odd story. Amy called us to step into the light and to find healing for ourselves and the world. And so that's what we're going to hear a little bit about today. And it's not just outreach. We're going to hear about how we stepped in the church, in our community, and heard God's calling. And I guess I also want to say that, God saying that we've heard God's calling feels pretty serious and momentous to me, and it is. And what we're going to hear about are just some ways, not all the ways, but some ways that we have heard that calling throughout the years. And so we're going to hear from a couple of folks, again, as I mentioned, who can talk about how we heard God's calling within us, and then folks are going to talk about how we heard God's calling that took us out of ourselves. And I think one of the things that you'll hear throughout all of this is that we, as those who have witnessed these callings, are as blessed by them as maybe the blessings that we hope to provide as well. So we're going to hear 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different ways, and that we've heard a calling. And we'll start with, if we may, Laura Keys. And Laura's going to speak to the calling to women, and each person is going to talk for about 3 to 4 minutes. And then after everyone talks, I've got some questions to pose to the panel about their experiences. So without further ado, Laura, if you wouldn't mind speaking with us about our calling to women.
I'd be glad to do that. I think probably everybody here knows something about me. I don't know if you know this about me, but I grew up moving around. And so when people ask me where I'm from, I don't really have a good answer. What I would like to say, though, is I'm from the Episcopal Church, because that was the unifying factor outside of my family of my growing up years. So I feel like this is home. And I've done a lot of things over the many, many years that I've been at Epiphany. I've been at Epiphany almost my entire adult life. But I was going to talk to you about a couple of things specifically this morning. One of them is straightforward women's ministry, as in the lay women in the church. I've been involved with the ECW off and on for many, many years. And I think that ECW might be, to some people, just sort of a ladies at lunch kind of idea. That's not what the Episcopal Church Women are. It's an organization that was founded in 1872 to empower women's voices in the church. And the purpose stated by the national organization is to carry out Christ's work throughout the world. And the ECW at Epiphany has done a lot of outreach in our community and through the UTO and the Episcopal Charities Foundation Relief Fund. We've spread that out a lot. It's always been, in all the years that I've been at Epiphany, it has been an active organization, and we're continuing that into the future. The UTO is sort of an offshoot of that, and the annual UTO ingathering does things that there's no money in the budget in the national church for. My favorite thing that the UTO has done over the years is they bought a plane for the Bishop of Alaska about 50 years ago, because the Bishop of Alaska has a huge area to cover and needed some help with that. So there's, and I'm active, obviously, in the Church Women now. The other piece of women in the church that I wanted to talk a little bit about is ordained women. Obviously, I'm not one of those, but I was on the search committee that called Claiborne to the church in 1985. And she was, at that time, the very first female rector in the entire Southeast. So it was a momentous step, both for her and for us. And we gave a unanimous recommendation to the vestry to call Claiborne, but we had to come to that. We had to sort of wrestle in the search committee with, was this dangerous? Was it going to hurt Epiphany? There were people who were afraid that a lot of folks would leave. The ordination of women was still pretty new, and there was a very mixed feeling about it. And there were people on the committee that were afraid that it was going to kill Epiphany. And we had to wrestle with that in the search committee. And we came to the consensus that we didn't think that was going to happen, but we thought it was important to take the risk. Not just to call the first woman, but to call this woman to our place. And I think from the perspective of all these many years later, it was a good decision. And we did lose some people, but we also gained people. And I think we gained tremendously from Claiborne's ministry at Epiphany. And we have subsequently gained from a number of other ordained women whose trail she blazed, including Nicole and Amy. And so that's sort of where I am with women's ministry at the church, lay ministry and ordained.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very insightful. Now I'd like to ask, moving a little bit more forward in time, I'd like to ask Bill and Pat Graves to talk about Epiphany in the beginning and in the midst of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 80s and 90s. And you all are muted.
Well, the person who should be talking about this is Larry Wilcox, of course. And if you read his letter in last week's, well, you can see the role that Epiphany had in that. And I don't. We sort of lived through it. I don't know that we were so actively involved in the ministry, but I'll tell you some of the things we did know about. One person people do not realize was one person at Epiphany who was involved in that was Carmen Gutierrez. And I don't know how many of you remember Carmen, but she marched to a different drummer. She was an unusual person, but she worked with I think it was called the AIDS Task Force at an office in downtown near Grady Hospital in Georgia State. Pat and I were working, Pat at Georgia State and me at at Grady at the time, and she announced to us one day that she was going to ride to work with us every day. She didn't ask us if she could. She just said, "I'm going to be riding with her, work with you." So we had to switch to driving my truck, which only held 2 people, to driving our car so that we could take Carmen down to work with the AIDS task force. And she worked with that for quite a long time. And she was also at the time living in a house about 2 doors down on Ponce, and her landlord had AIDS and died of AIDS, and he's one of the first persons buried in our memorial garden. And his name was Michael Norwood. If you look at the plaque up near the top of the first one, he's one of the first people who was interred in our place.
Yeah. Some of the focus of Carmen's work was on Jerusalem House, which was at that time essentially a hospice.
Hey, Vic, you might want to come and hear this.
And Carmen was active in that, and Carmen was good at getting under your skin. But somebody else involved in that was John Nesser, who had been on the vestry, among other things, and was on the board at Jerusalem House. He was an accountant, a very bright guy, very effective, and he had worked early on in setting up the financial backing to get Jerusalem House going, and was early on one of our contacts with that thing. So it helped us to deal internally and externally with things, because John's partner at the time was
Andy
Belcher, who died of AIDS. And
Oh, message.
Could I ask folks to put their phones on mute if you're not speaking? Thank you. Go ahead, Pat. And
Too. So, okay.
having lived 60 years with sociologists, my theory about how a lot of social changes come when people make radical changes in their outlook, and therefore the basis for their course of action, it comes through individual experiences. It's what your life experience is. And part of our experience with this was with people we loved anyhow. You know, we love these people anyhow, and suddenly they're devastated. What can we do? And John's partner, Andy Belcher, got AIDS and died rather quickly after anybody knew about it, because it was not the sort of thing to talk about much. But when Andy died, let me back up and say something about his contribution. He had been at Emory and had been a friend of Bill Lemons,
Who was the
a choral director there. And Andy was at Epiphany, and occasionally he was interested in music and had some contribution to our acquisition of the organ we have now. But it was Bill Lemons had a harpsichord which was stored at John and Andy's house, which is the second house over on North Ponce as it joins Ponce up close to Artwood, a lovely house which they had bought and rescued. It had been not cared for, and they put in a lot of work restoring their house, but they stored Bill Lemon's harpsichord. So when we needed a harpsichord at the church, we could use that harpsichord, and that was our connection for that in a way. One of their very specific things about it. But when Andy died, after Andy died, there was a funeral for a while, and then a couple of months later, John arranged for a concert, a sort of memorial concert in honor of Andy, which we had at the church, which was a restorative thing. We had people from outside the church who were friends of his, as well as people in the church. Afterwards, there was a great cookout. We had a cookout at that house, and somehow or another, it was one of the best healing circumstances that I had been involved in at the time. Bill can tell you about the musical feature.
Well, I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that Andy had requested that Hamilton,
Reed
Hamilton is a priest now, later became a priest, but he is the campus minister at the University of Michigan. But he was singing in our choir. They're a very nice voice, and Andy had requested that Reed and I sing the duet from the Pearl Fishers opera, and we sang at that concert, and that was a very moving experience for many of us. But we're going on way long. But I also need to mention that Andy Belcher was one responsible for Bill Lemons donating the nativities to Epiphany. So that's but we run out of time. We need to mention very quickly that, of course, another AIDS death in our church, which was was very traumatic, was Mark Matthews, who was our organist. And Mark and Andy, by the way, both are also buried in our memorial garden. Yeah. But Mark was our organist and choirmaster, and he caught AIDS and eventually died from it. And so that was very traumatic for the church at that. And so, but that's that it's more a personal thing for us. But Ruth Healy, for example, as Larry mentioned, his letter was very instrumental in working with that. So that's what we know about Epiphany's involvement in that.
Ruth, in a much more dignified, but in a very no-nonsense way, would have nothing of nervousness and defensiveness about AIDS or anything else, which was a very hot topic for years and years. And they helped us to say, these are our people and we love them and we're going to take care of them. And because we're losing people, we're going to learn to take care of ourselves in a new way.
Thank you. Thank you. A very nice way to hit on one of our themes, taking care of ourselves and taking care of others. So now I'd like to ask Jeanette Hansen, who also wrote a wonderful article in this week's newsletter about our calling to the
You're muted.
I'm sorry, about our calling to the hungry. Thank you, Bill.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of enjoyed thinking back to the days when I was involved at the early days of Peachtree Pine. And I think Epiphany became involved probably, I guess, at Claiborne's behest, that there was, I'm sure, a need to have different organizations, mostly churches, provide dinner at Peachtree Pine. And for Epiphany to get involved, it was good because it was outside the church. It wasn't dropping things off to go to a food pantry. And you really did go a world away. I mean, the people there are our neighbors, but we don't see them, we don't know them. And so it was, it really was sort of going out into the world, which I think was what was so important about it. And for me, the real challenges were getting the food organized, making sure I had enough volunteers, making sure they all had jobs, sort of getting everything done. And I found that I really enjoyed that, and having a big project that lasted 2 days, and having a visible satisfaction at the end when you saw the people enjoying the food and coming back for seconds, because I had a job where I was sitting at a desk all day and not really, for a lot of the time, not interacting with people. So for me, it was a challenge that I really enjoyed. And then I kind of looked at it, in retrospect, it wasn't so much working with the homeless, it was providing a structure for people from Epiphany to work with the homeless, because they were the people doing the most of the serving and doing everything. I was just sort of getting everything organized and facilitating that happening. But I do remember one thing that was funny was when we, we had fixed the meal and had gotten set up and we started to serve in this long line of people. And then all of a sudden, the line of people ran to the other side of the room. And there was someone who had been staying at the homeless shelter who had gotten a job at Chick-fil-A and had shown up with bags and bags of like chicken biscuits. So everybody left our line and went over there and sort of had to stand there and wait until they'd eaten their chicken biscuits and came back over to our side. So that was funny.
Competitive
And then
parody.
and then one time, I remember it was Martin Luther King weekend, and they had a speaker and were playing his speeches. And while we were there, I was listening to speeches of his that I'd never heard. There were all the ones that we hear, the I Have a Dream speech, and different speeches that you hear or hear clips of. But I was like, wow, I never heard this before. And so that was really nice. And then I guess another sort of personal thing was that my children were in middle school. So a lot of their activities were sort of like out in the world and less family things we did. So it was a nice thing that we were able to do as a family that was out in the world. And my daughter recently emailed me because I was talking about this to her, and she said that she had really good memories of that, of doing that. And so I guess that was it. It was more that it was sort of providing the sort of shared experience for people from Epiphany to be able to go out there and be out in the world with our neighbors that we would never know otherwise. That's about it, I think.
Thank you, Jeanette. That was very, very interesting. And I think we're starting to hear some themes. And I also appreciate the emphasis on bringing our young people out into the world with us. Thank you. So now I'd like to ask Erin Braden to talk about ministry that we did that's somewhat similar to what Jeanette described, but a little different, and mostly focused on women and children. Thank you, Erin.
Hey, sure. I am going to talk about serving at Hagar's House, which is a shelter for women and children in Decatur that probably most people know about. And it was interesting when I was looking at the history of Decatur Cooperative Ministries, or DCM, which runs the shelter. It was a fascinating story of just neighbors coming together to address issues in the community. And they had a very entrepreneurial model of doing needs assessments and then figuring out new ministries in cooperation with all the member churches. So they started up DEAM, Decatur Emergency Assistance Ministry, and then that became an independent agency 4 years later in '77. And back in '82, DCM started the Emergency Shelter Task Force to try to address homelessness prevention. And back in the early days of that, they didn't have a specific shelter. They held services in different churches in Decatur. And the focus now is still has coalesced around preventing homelessness. And they have 3 programs: transitional housing program, Hagar's House, and then what's called Project Take Charge, to help families settle into safe, stable homes. So our rector, Claiborne, back in the late 80s, and other church members got Epiphany involved in those early days. And we've supported the Hagar's House shelter ever since by providing dinners over the course of a week, 4 times a year. And Ann Warner, who was running the ministry for several years before she moved, remembers cooking for the shelter in the 80s before it was had a set location on Church Street. And there are countless Epiphanites who've organized and cooked meals and served there over the years, including Cindy Bell and Roberta Long and Kathleen Reinhardt and so many others. My family and I started serving there when Isabel was still a baby. So I think it was late 2002, which was the year that the Church Street shelter was opened. And I remember cooking at home and then serving there with Isabel in a, carrier, I forget what those are called, Baby Bjorn, on my chest. And thinking that I felt really called to share what we had with other families. And I felt so blessed by having children, and really wanted to connect with other mothers who were struggling. And as one way to seek and serve Christ in all people. So the fact that the dinners were shared and that we broke bread together felt like an opportunity, really, to be transformed. And though the relationships we developed were for that one night, it really, truly felt like neighbors helping neighbors and being in community with neighbors. So our children, Isabel and Boyd, grew up playing with the children at the shelter in their tiny little playground that's right at the entrance. And usually Chris's job was to watch the children so that I could work on the dinner. And sometimes our children would see classmates staying at the shelter who were in their schools in Decatur and realized that their friends had to struggle with challenges that they never had to face. So I think it was a very formative experience for them growing up. It was also fraught. I mean, all the shelter residents were Black and we were white, and it felt very important to be in relationship with them versus saving anyone, and that was a hard thing to figure out. It was challenging. My fondest memories are of holding babies so that their mothers could have a chance to eat and serve their other children, and talking with children about their day. It really, I think, when I look at the work of DCM and Hagar's House, they have helped so many families, mothers and children, transition to really stable housing, and which just changes their whole lives. So sadly, it's as much of a need as ever, and that has not changed, if not gotten worse, which makes me want to work on the systemic problems that cause poverty and homelessness. But certainly serving at the shelter and being in relationship with the residents for those short periods of time has transformed me and I think my family in ways that I'm very grateful for.
Thank you, Erin. I heard themes that are carrying forward in what you said, talking about relationships and transformation, work in communities. And I also heard how the organization took an effort to figure out what the needs were, as opposed to perhaps thinking they knew what the needs were and moving forward. So thank you. Now I'd like to ask Kim Finnegan to speak about how Epiphany's been called beyond the borders of our country. You're muted.
Okay, got it. Good morning, everyone. So when my family started attending Epiphany a little while back, from day one, we heard about Epiphany's partnership with BTI, Bishop Tharp Business and Technology Institute in Lakai, Haiti. And it seemed like the work that was going on there, it was so robust, and people, a number of Epiphanites were involved. I assumed that it had been a ministry for many, many, many years. And in hindsight, it was a relatively new ministry when I started to get involved. And so I dipped my toe in a little bit with meeting with the students when they would come here. So basically, Epiphany's partnership was sharing time, talent, treasure with BTI, again, in whatever way they needed it at the time. So we would host students in the summertime here in Atlanta, and that's how I started getting involved a bit. And heard all sorts about the Epiphany Guest House at BTI, and that was primarily funded through the Epiphany parishioners. And what that allowed the school to do is not only build a guest house to serve the visitors to Lakai, but it was also a source of revenue for the school, and it provided a working business, an operating business for the students to learn and work and learn more about business operations, entrepreneurship. So finally, I decided, okay, I'm going to go visit Haiti with one of the groups. We had groups going down at least once a year, but probably a little bit more. So got all set to go down with a group of Epiphanites. Got my presentation together. I was going to present a short piece to some of the students on non-traditional business models. The day before, I decided I really know nothing about Haiti. I need to learn a little something, and downloaded a history of Haiti. Started listening to that the night before we left, listened on the plane on the way down, and the book was all about just the cycles of political corruption and unrest and poverty and the distrust of Americans and American help among Haitians. And I could clearly see why that existed. But I remember thinking, oh my gosh, what am I doing? What can I do to help this country that is really such a mess? So many people have tried to help, and what am I going to be able to do? So we get there and take the long drive from Port-au-Prince to Lakai, and it was a few years after the earthquake, but it was there was still devastation, of course, poverty, and I was a little down. I was thinking, what am I going to offer? The second day on campus, after we had presented a little bit, we kind of came up just off the cuff with a Shark Tank type game to play with the students, where we put them in groups and had them come up with their own business idea. and we said that we were going to, we all threw some money in a pot and said we were going to offer the winners, a cash prize. The excitement and enthusiasm and energy that created at the moment, it was just like, it was just amazing. And all of a sudden the light went on, and it's like, okay, this isn't all about, what can I do to it's not about me, and what I can do to help. It was seeing the excitement and the enthusiasm. And then we went away for a day and then came back and heard the plans, and the again, just the excitement over a small opportunity like that was really amazing. Now, fast forward, that's what got me hooked. And that developed into an entrepreneurship program that we've developed at Epiphany, MYB Lakai. And to date, we have 3 young entrepreneurs in Lakai. They have each, with our help and guidance, but their hard work and their great ideas, have started their own businesses. We have a fishmonger who buys fish from the local fishermen and actually has a freezer, which apparently is not common, and then delivers the fish to hotels, restaurants, whatever. And he was our first winner. And we have 2 other entrepreneurs. One makes quality backpacks for the students. So they're locally made, they're better quality. And, he employs folks to help him make and distribute those. And then lastly, a young woman who started a sort of health smoothie cafe, really. And of course, with the pandemic, sit-down restaurants have not done well. And so she's had to close her doors, but she came back to us and, made the pivot that so many of us had to make during the pandemic. And she took, or she's taking her business mobile, and she's purchasing basically a motorcycle with a food truck on the back. And her new business plan is amazing. And I think, we've had all the resources in the world here as business folks to help us through this pandemic. And they haven't, and they're still resilient, and they're still in business, and they're still thinking about ways, to advance their business. And that just is super exciting to me.
Thank you, Kim. I think we're continuing to hear themes. So, similar themes. So, I have some questions that I've asked the panelists to think about. But before we do that, I wanted to open it up to see if any of you have any questions or comments that you'd like to make.
Yes, actually, I do have a comment, and that is watching ECW when they got this money in trust and then distributed it. And I've been so impressed by they are not giving to the organizations that we all know. They're giving to a lot of small startups where $300 or $500 can mean the difference between having to close or being open. So I just wanted to add that those women have been thinking very carefully about how that money is spent and where it can really do a lot of good in the community. I know for myself, I brought forward my neighbor who was offering sewing classes to refugee women in the Clarkson area. And she needed sewing machines, both to repair what she had and to new, and they funded that. And so that was several years ago. But I just wanted to say that that's one thing that has made me very respectful of ECW and the process that they go through. And I hope a lot of younger women will decide to join that organization because they have a lot to offer. So.
I wanted to say something sort of in line with Ellen, is the third entrepreneurship grant actually came through the ECW for the juice bar. We also, I was thinking when Kim was talking about the old proverb, give a man a fish and he eats for a day, teach a man to fish and he eats forever. And I think that's, with Hagar's House and with the BTI project and with this organization locally, Automotive Training Center, that we gave a grant to, and with some of these things, we have the opportunity to help someone else build something. It's not just giving money. It's giving an opportunity to learn a skill, start a business, get your feet back under you when life has knocked you down. And I think that's, I just think that's an important thing. And I think that we have tried in a lot of different ways to do that in our community and in the world.
Thank you. So maybe we can jump off from that and talk a little bit more about what values in our baptism that we're living out through our baptismal covenant through this work that each of you have been engaged in. I'm asking the panelists now to respond.
I think for me, what the most powerful one in my experiences with people has been seeking and serving Christ in all people, and working towards justice. So that I feel like that when I see Christ in another's face, it is as much transforms me as it does others. And in fact, I don't think it's necessarily transformative to others that I'm there serving, but it certainly is for me.
Others on the panel want to say anything about our baptismal covenant?
I think what Erin said, I just wanted to say, that yes, I agreed, because I pulled out my prayer book and looked up my baptismal covenant this morning, and those were the ones that the items that I identified with, and I agree that it's transformative to us, maybe not the people that we are serving, but certainly for us. And we did, and the feeding ministry until, exactly almost a year ago, continued, not at Peachtree Pine, but at the Gateway Center. So it was something that was continuous all the years. It never really stopped, feeding the poor.
Well, even now, we can't go in person, but we're funding meals at Hagar's House, and continuing in the ways that we can manage to continue. I don't know who else was around then, but at the very first days of Hagar's House, We actually spent the night there. Bob Thompson and I spent the night there one night.
That's when it was at Holy Trinity, right? I mean, wasn't it at Holy Trinity?
It was at Holy Trinity then. Yeah.
Yeah.
Laura, do you have any recollections of the search committee talking about the baptismal covenant in your calling, in seeking who you would call as our next rector?
You know, I don't exactly, Lisa, but we actually called somebody before we called Claiborne, and he turned us down.
Wow.
And he turned us down because he said we needed to work on stewardship.
Huh.
And we took that seriously. And the vestry and the search committee were the stewardship committee that year and worked hard on spreading the message and reaping the reward. But that was that's not exactly your baptismal covenant, but he called us on our Christian walk and we heard him and we tried to do something about it. And so we regrouped then and looked at a pool of candidates again, and Claiborne came out of that pool of candidates.
Yes.
So that was an interesting experience. I don't think the search committees are done in exactly the same way these days. I'm not sure, that's the only one I've been on. But the plan then was that the search committee came up with a candidate and recommended the candidate to the vestry, and if the vestry accepted their recommendation, then the call was issued. So that's what we had done. We had recommended they call this man Robert Certain, who was a priest in Mississippi, and the vestry called him and he turned us down, and then we went from there. And I think we were better for that. We were a stronger community. We had shifted our focus some, and so I think that's consistent with what we're instructed to do, whether it's specifically set up that way in the baptismal covenant or not.
I remember that because Bill was on that search committee as well.
There are four of us still at Epiphany who were on that committee. Bill Graves, Wayne Urban, Dennis Edmiston, and me.
Yeah. Well,
so
what happened was,
after all these years, and still
that it was so uncertain. It was such a dicey thing to do that Bishop Child, who was supportive, came, and there was going to be a meeting, having lunch at your house when you were on Parkwood, and it was a rainy Sunday and a miserable kind of day, really. And it felt to me that it was going to be vestry and spouses and search committee people and spouses at your house that you had graciously offered to feed. Again, we're feeding, and eating together really is an important thing, whoever it is. But it felt to me to ride with Bishop Child from the church over to your house so that he could find it. He didn't know where your house was. And so I took on the dangerous job of riding with Bishop Child, who was a driver, a spirited driver, let's see, to do it. But it came, I remember sitting in at that luncheon meeting, and it was like going around the room and everybody was raising the question of people won't come. It's a scary thing. And the back and forth that went on in that meeting had a lot of zing. There was a lot of zing in that meeting. Is it, yes, we could do that. It was kind of a leap of faith that I felt at that time. It was also a nice lunch, but it was a dynamic kind of meeting, and it sort of encouraged the vestry to see what it was that the search committee had gone through. And I don't think we would have dealt with the AIDS problems in the way that we did if we hadn't had Claiborne, who was on board, was a great resource for us during that time.
Well, I think Claiborne was very formative at Epiphany. You know, we had the priest before Claiborne had a number of personal issues going on, and that was kind of an unsettled time for him and for us. And so this was a chance for us to get back on the right path. And I think it was a leap of faith, but I think that we had taken it. I think we took the whole process very seriously, and I think we recognized. Maybe we recognize Christ in Claiborne. I mean, you know,
That's possible.
but I think she also presented to us the possibility that we could do more engaging, exciting things than we had been doing.
Yeah, we did.
So,
But I would also add with regard to Jeanette's work with not mainly with Peachtree Pine, but to continue to some extent with the Gateway Project, that it was a very spiritually reassuring experience to cook the meals, to see how are we gonna deal with the wonderful things we got from the food bank, because we got to see how the food bank worked and how we got things there, and we could prepare more interesting, more exciting, more varied meals. It wasn't just get some food in these people. It was prepare a good meal, an attractive meal, and do it with the spirit of adventure, as it were, and then to transfer that feeling that the great sense of camaraderie among the people who were doing that work. Which I missed. That's one of the things I missed this year, is not getting to feed those folks. That was a grand thing to be able to do. Very reassuring, I think, and an important connection for us to maintain.
thank you. So I wanted to ask now the panelists to react to maybe two things that are in tension when we do any of this work. One is that these things are often not easy. They can be a little scary, and we come up with bumps along the road. But at the same time, they're transformative, both to the individual and to our community. So could all of you speak to that a little bit?
I can start with and I spoke to this. It was while I was in Haiti in the middle of this mission trip that the whole purpose came to me. The purpose, I don't know what I thought I was going to be doing when I went down, but it was while I was there, and it was just a big light bulb, and I'm not even sure how to explain it, but it was seeing the enthusiasm and the optimism in these young people after spending the last couple of days thinking this is useless. How can we possibly help? And yeah, I clearly I was so wrong. And seeing the spirit of these young people today and their resilience is completely opposite from my feelings, in the first day or two of my trip.
Lisa, I'm going to leave in just a second because we're going to outdoor church. But I wanted to say that I think that everything that we do together to build our own community makes us more able to reach out to other communities. And so I think that we need both parts of that. And I think we've got a lot of people working on both parts of that, but the work is never done. The Church Women has had the great privilege of administering the Harvey Fund. And we have taken that responsibility very seriously. And I feel like the impact of some of those gifts that have been able to give, or, I mean, maybe some of them have done nothing. But I think that the fact that we can give a gift to the Sewing Center or to the Bishop Tharp Institute or to the Automotive Learning Center, is very empowering, and it's empowering to those people, but it's also very connecting.
Thank you.
So I'll see you in the parking lot if you're there.
Thank you.
And check out Erin's comments in the chat if you haven't seen them.
Yeah. And I think that the issue of justice comes up with regard to the matter of dealing with AIDS to some respect, because it is grossly unjust to condemn people to die of a dreadful disease because you think the way they got the disease was bad. And of course, that was a gross overgeneralization under the circumstances. But I think caring for people with AIDS in that time was not only an act of mercy, it's an act that has to do with seeking justice, because it's unjust. If you can remember, there are a lot of people who are too young to remember now the sort of fear and trembling that was associated with AIDS. But Ronald Reagan was president, and it was not nice. He didn't want to hear about AIDS. That was unpleasant, and he only wanted good things. And the Surgeon General, Dr. Koop, got together the study and said, HIV is related to AIDS. It's a communicable disease. It's killing people. This is what we need to do to try to take care of it. This was the gist of that report. But there was an interview with him where he said that one of the things they did is that he saw to it that they printed up that report and recommendation to hand to the president on the best paper and the most impressive kind of binding they could get, so that it looked respectable, to help to make the message palatable. The thing was that the president of the United States couldn't hear anything unpleasant about people dying an unpleasant death. And in our own way, we came to deal with our little fraction of that great, what was part an injustice. And we didn't do it for any crusading reason. We were doing it because we were doing it for people that we loved, but we were able to love them for various reasons. So there.
So thank you, Pat. So I'm seeing Nicole.
Yep. Yeah, it's so good to be with you. I've got to head to church, but I'm so glad that we're here sharing these stories. And one of the things I want to say before I go is really just to riff off a little bit of Laura's comment that, and we talked about this at the beginning of these sessions too, that what is happening above the river is really connected to what is happening below the river. The health and well-being of our own personal lives and our community is connected to how we are able to engage and transform and reorient ourselves in right relationship to others. And so I'm so glad to hear all the wonderful stories about the ways that Epiphanites have risked. And as Pat, you said, took a leap of faith. And I'm curious to talk in the coming weeks together about what are those things that are stirring in us now? What are those invitations? What is animating us going forward, coming out of this COVID time, this dormant time, into new life as we enter the Easter season? So such a joy to be with you. Please do continue the conversation. I'm always sorry that we have to cut these off to start another service, but do stay on Zoom and continue to talk about these wonderful things together. Many blessings.
Yeah, I can recommend a book. It's not a Christian book. It's by Abraham Verghese, who's ethnically Indian, although he grew up and was initially trained in Addis Ababa, but is an American, subsequently trained physician who wrote a book called In the Country of Hearts. And he deals with his own experience of being an infectious disease specialist in East Tennessee, I think it was, at the time AIDS was coming out, and the stories that he saw of people who were coming through. And it's a beautifully written book. Verghese has gone on to write more. He is a creative writer who also teaches in medical school, and I would recommend it highly. But you can recapture some of the terror that people were having to deal with at the time. So anyhow.
Thank you. And thank you.
He also is a wonderful explanation how one of his patients saw Jesus. And it's the description of this with ultimate respect for the religious experience of somebody whose experience you don't share yourself at all, but the ultimate sort of meta religious sensitivity to another person's experience. And it's touching. His name is Abraham Verghese.
Thank you, Pat. And thanks to Nicole to sort of summarizing for us what we've talked about today and how it fits into the larger context of the discussions that we've been having and what we hope to have going forward. Any last comments?
This is Peter. I'd like to pick up on a point that Patty just made. In recent weeks, we've seen how the Biden administration has been very upfront, not only about prioritizing a response to the pandemic, but also to humanizing the event and helping us really have a meaningful, even a spiritual perspective on what all this suffering and death has meant and the importance of reaching out to one another. Several years ago, I heard a retrospective program about before the pandemic, about the advent of AIDS in the world and in the United States, and in particular, the Reagan administration's response, or better, non-response, affirmative, intentional non-response to the AIDS crisis. And in fact, it was at least 4 years after AIDS was recognized as a contagious disease, a disease that could potentially affect all in the population and not just some tiny cohort. Remember, AIDS was first thought of as a disease peculiar to Haitian men.
Oh.
And because the first cases known in the United States seemed to come out of a Haitian community, I think probably in Miami or someplace. I'm speculating there. But 4 years after AIDS became recognized as a worldwide event, a reporter at a White House press conference asked President Reagan, what does your administration propose to do about AIDS? And I think one of his acolytes, it may have been his press secretary, stepped to the microphone and said, well, here's what we know about AIDS. None of us at the White House have it. And then there was this malicious laughter. Everybody in the White House representatives all laughed out loud and sort of elbowed one another and so forth. This is 4 years after the AIDS crisis began. So I think of President Biden and compare him to President Reagan.
When it came out that Rock Hudson had AIDS, and that he was a friend of Reagan's, that he sort of had to own up to it. But I remember Ruth Healy, who was a chaplain at the AIDS clinic at Grady, having a sermon. And I had a close friend at work who was kind of my Friday lunch partner for several years, who had AIDS. And she was talking about seeing miracles all the time, but not the miracles people were hoping for. And somehow it was just a very helpful sermon to me at the time.
Mother Ruth lives in here with us now at Park Springs, and she's quite
we are so honored to know
her. Yeah.
Oh,
She helps with our services inside the walls here. So.
Well, she was at that first Peachtree Pine serving, and she had never seen moon pies before. And we had all these moon pies, and then there were like not enough. So we had these little Debbie oatmeal things. And she was like, nobody wanted them. What are these things? What are these moon pies? I've never seen them before. So it's always, we're always running into cultural things.
Well, thank you all for this. One of the things that in the whole presentation that you all have done, the thing that speaks to me is coupling it with the baptismal covenant. Every one of these has said and has spoken about respecting the dignity of every human being. And because often the church's response to things is paternalistic. And I don't hear that. I haven't heard that from what you all have been sharing about the work that you all have been doing. A little bit of we've known. I've known a little bit about it from Mike and Molly McAuliffe, but to hear it from those of you who've been directly involved, it's exciting. That's underlying the work that you all have been doing, is respecting the dignity of every human being, which is exciting. Thank you all.
Lisa, I'd just like to make an observation that so many of the leaders that are speaking this morning are women, having talked about the issue with whether to call the first female rector in this part of the country. I'm just always impressed at how much the passion of women can accomplish. I'm kind of making generalizations that probably aren't quite fair, but it seems sometimes that men will want to analyze things and tell you why you can't do it. But women will simply get it done. I don't know. It's just a thought.
We appreciate that, Paul. And we need you too.
We're gratified to know that. Thank you.
Lisa, one thing that occurs to me is that Epiphany has done a lot of really neat things over the years, and varying degrees of intensity. And each one of these programs have gone through, I think, ebb and flows of energy and moments when people wondered whether we could, I imagine Jeanette had times when she was scrambling to get people to get in to serve, on a certain day. But it also occurs to me that Episcopal Church worldwide doesn't always look like Epiphany. Okay, there's still lots of Episcopal churches, little rural churches. We're an urban church. There are lots of small churches that really are reluctant to deal with some of these issues. And that's part of that, to my mind, part of that under the river that's larger than just our congregation, but it's part of the under river of church of our churches, of our congregations throughout the country. That it's, and I don't think that's the majority of them, but it still exists. So lest we forget the task too. Sometimes it's bigger than the national church, and you get down to the local diocesan or parish level, or mission churches. There's still a lot of learning to do.
Well, I want to thank the panelists for participating. I think it's probably time to wrap up. And I want to thank all the panelists for your participation and your honesty and your enthusiasm and your passion for what you've been doing. So thanks to all of you.
Thank you for moderating.
It was a wonderful program. I feel very proud and honored to be an Epiphanite and to share my church work with so many of you. Very grateful.
Can I say something to Kim? Is that I'd like to watch Dr. Gates, who does the Roots program on television, Finding Your Roots. And one of the things I've learned about Haiti and watching that over the last year or two is that there were every now and again, they find in somebody's family background a freed Black person from Haiti that we're feeding in. We don't appreciate that contribution to us, that we look at Haiti and say, oh, it's a mess, what can we do? Is that from way back, because they had an early revolution in which there were free people of color, and they have fed into the culture, the very rich culture. It was always in New Orleans, but where they've got everything. But I learned something about Haiti from watching that those Haitians were spreading a certain kind of indomitable will over the centuries.
Okay. Shall we leave?
Yeah.
We're leaving now.
Going.
Yep.
Bye.
Everyone.